What's good, everyone? This is Half-Blood Harry, and boy do we have a treat for you. Luke Castellan rescued Harry from Dursleys and Hermes, revealed 19 contracts Dumbledore signed, hit subscribe and the bell. Let the story begin. Chapter 1, The Smell of Wards. The wards smelled like old tea and justified authority. Luke Castellan stood across the street from number 4 Privet Drive, hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket that was 3 sizes too large for the August heat, and breathed them in. Most people couldn't smell wards. Most people couldn't smell anything magical. They existed either inside the veil looking out or outside it looking at nothing. Luke had spent 3 years in neither category. He'd lived in the in-between, picking apart divine architecture the way a kid picks at a scab, and now he could read magical infrastructure the way a ship's pilot reads current. Not with his eyes, with the specific, pressure-sensitive part of his attention that had replaced what other people used for things like optimism. These wards were old work, mid-century construction, built with the confidence that came from being very powerful and entirely unquestioned. Whoever had laid them had done it the way you poured a foundation, not as a temporary measure, but as a declaration about the order of things. The outer ring was Muggle repulsion, standard issue, nothing worth examining. The second ring was a notice-me-not compounded with a truth nudge, which was more interesting. Visitors approaching too close would find themselves seized by the sudden, concrete certainty that they had somewhere better to be. The third ring was where it got ugly. Blood anchor wards, specific genetic architecture constructed around a living relative, self-sustaining as long as the target remained inside the perimeter. The kind that told you, if you understood their construction, something deeply uncomfortable about the decision that went into building them in the first place. Luke understood their construction. He'd been standing here for 11 minutes, long enough to map the outer 2 rings completely. The blood anchor's architecture was already clear to him, clear the way a lock became clear once you pressed your ear to the mechanism and listened to it breathe. This was good work, very good work, the kind that aged like concrete and resisted interference from anyone who hadn't spent years studying its specific grammar. Whoever had built this had wanted it to last exactly 15 years and had built it with that number in mind, the way you'd set an alarm for a precise time and then not think about it again. Luke had been thinking about it for 3 months. The house was a beige box on a beige street. Every house here was a slight variation on the same beige box, arranged with the particular uniformity of a neighborhood that had decided order was the highest virtue and enforced it through homeowners' association and ambient social pressure. The gardens were identically neat. The cars rotated through 3 approved models. The curtains in number 4 were genuinely beige. A single light was on, one window, northwest corner, upper floor. He'd known it would be. He'd been clocking that window for 3 months in other people's dreams, which sounded stranger than it was because he hadn't been watching on purpose and the dreams hadn't been his. They'd been intrusions. Flickering, miserable dispatches arriving at 3 in the morning like collect calls he hadn't agreed to accept. A narrow room, a squeaking mattress, bars on the window, literal bars, which had taken him a full week to accept as accurate, and a green-eyed kid who did homework by the light of an illegally concealed wand and wore the specific exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting rescue. Not given up on escape, just stopped calculating it as a realistic variable. Luke knew that face. He'd been making it since he was 8. He crossed the street. The notice-me-not pressed against him like a firm hand on his sternum. You have somewhere to be, you know you do. Why are you stopping here? And Luke pushed back, not with force, but with a targeted, deliberate boredom. The wards had been calibrated against mortal interference. They hadn't been designed to account for someone who'd spent 2 years in Kronos' service learning how divine architecture was assembled, and more critically, how it came apart at its seams when you found the right thread to pull. He reached the garden gate. The blood anchor spiked a hot, specific warning like touching a live wire through insulation, and Luke stopped walking and started working. Ward cracking was not dramatic. People imagined it as combat, lightning, opposing forces, spectacular displays of will. It looked nothing like that. It looked like a man standing very still at a garden gate with his eyes slightly unfocused, making movements with his left hand too small to be legible from a distance, with the concentrated blankness on his face of someone doing long division. The wards had architecture. Architecture had load points. Identify the load points, understand what they were anchored to, and then carefully, specifically, without announcing yourself to the whole street, reroute. The blood anchor was anchored to a child's continued presence inside the perimeter. Luke rerouted it to a child's continued existence on the planet, less restrictive definition. One he could defend on philosophical grounds if pressed. The magical intent of protection remained technically intact. The geographic constraint did not. The gate swung open without a sound. He went up the path, past a garden that had the aggressively maintained neatness of someone who decided visible order compensated for a deeper chaos they'd stopped examining, and reached the front door. Chubb deadbolt 3 Muggle security bolts, the preference of someone who trusted mechanical solutions over magical ones, which meant either no magical capability or a deliberate distrust of it. Luke picked the lot in 40 seconds using a set of tools he'd acquired in New Orleans from a woman who hadn't asked where he'd be using them, because she'd correctly assessed that knowing would only complicate the transaction. The hallway smelled of furniture polish and something underneath it, something cooked in and stale and familiar. Not the smell of food exactly, but the smell of food prepared with resentment over years, which was its own distinct register once you knew it. He moved to the stairs. The house breathed around him, a large, sleeping shape in the master bedroom to his right, snoring with the self-satisfied regularity of a man who had never developed the habit of examining his behavior before sleep. A second shape in the smaller room to his left, accompanied by the faint electronic drone of a games console that had been left running. The northwest bedroom was up the stairs, turn right, and he knew which door it was from the dreams with a precision that required no counting. He knocked 3 times, quiet, then Harry Potter, silence. Not sleep silence, the silence of someone already awake who had gone still and watchful and was running calculations. "I'm on the outside of your door," Luke said, keeping his voice barely above a breath. "That means I cracked the wards, which means I'm either one of yours, someone operating outside your people's official channels, or a threat. The fact that I knocked instead of walking in probably rules out the third option. My name is Luke Castellan. I'm going to say 3 things, and then I need you to open this door, because I came a long way and your downstairs neighbors are going to get a ward fluctuation migraine in about 4 minutes when the rerouted magic hits the ambient layer, and someone in this house strikes me as the type to call the police at the first unusual headache." A pause. Then the sound of someone moving, not scrambling, moving with measured purpose, and the door opened. Harry Potter was 5'4" and wearing a hand-me-down t-shirt sized for someone 3 weight classes above him, on a frame that had done most of its critical growth years without adequate fuel. He had a wand in his right hand, pointed at Luke's sternum, held with the practiced, pressure-tested steadiness of someone who had pointed it at things that shot back. His eyes green, yes, Luke had known that, but the dreams hadn't fully rendered the quality of them. The way they moved with rapid, systematic precision across Luke's face and jacket and hands, and the specific angle of his shoulders, cataloging, prioritizing, dismissing, did not blink. He looked at the scar along Luke's jaw, then at his hands, then at the set of his stance. "You said 3 things," Harry said. Luke recalibrated. He'd prepared for scared. He'd prepared for aggressive, for confused, for the dull-eyed compliance of someone who'd been managed so long they'd stopped reacting. He had not fully prepared for tactical. "You're right," he said. "I said one, which was my name. Second thing, I don't work for Dumbledore, the Ministry of Magic, Voldemort, or any variation or subsidiary thereof. I work for myself and, in an extended and thoroughly complicated sense, for my father, who is an Olympian god and therefore operates above your entire governmental structure in the hierarchy of magical authority. Third thing, I have a portkey to a location your ministry cannot trace, and I have room in this conversation for your trunk, your owl, and 3 questions before we need to leave." Harry looked at him for 4 full seconds without moving. "Show me your hands," he said. Luke held them out, palms up. Harry's eyes tracked across them, the calluses at the base of the fingers, the particular thickening along the sword grip ridge, the half-moon indentation on the right wrist that came from years of hilt catch. He looked at the scar on Luke's forearm, the one from the Draken in Tennessee that had required 6 stitches and a long conversation with himself about hubris. "Those calluses are from a sword," Harry said. "That scar on your forearm is from something that bit you and wasn't a dog." He paused. "You're a demigod. Half-blood," Luke said, "son of Hermes. God of travelers, thieves, and messages, among other things. Which means," Harry said, already turning back toward the room and moving to a trunk that was. Luke registered with something in his chest that wasn't quite surprise, already half-packed. "There's a parallel magical world entirely separate from mine that Dumbledore has never once mentioned, populated by people with sufficient power to crack his wards." He unlatched an owl cage near the desk, and a white owl blinked into wakefulness with the long-suffering patience of a creature that had been woken for emergencies enough times to have formed a policy about it. And you came specifically to this address because I'll answer that outside, Luke said, 2 minutes left before the migraine. Harry looked at the owl. The owl looked at Harry. Some decision passed between them that Luke wasn't party to, and then Harry detached the cage's travel perch and began moving with the efficient, no-wasted motion speed of someone who had performed this sequence in his head many times before the occasion to perform it physically had arrived. Trunk is extended inside, Harry said. Undetectable charm, 3rd year, I'll take the front end. Wand holster, Luke said. I don't want you dropping that if we have to run. Harry reached behind the desk and clipped a holster to his forearm without looking, the motion of someone who'd made the same adjustment in the dark, in worse conditions, and settled the wand into it. He picked up the trunk's front handle, nodded, and they moved. Down the stairs in silence, the trunk's wheels an inch off the floor, neither of them coordinating it out loud because the geometry of the situation made the coordination obvious. Through the hallway, past the furniture polish smell and the framed family photos that lined the wall, Luke didn't look at them closely. But he caught in peripheral vision the complete and systematic absence of a certain green-eyed face from the holiday pictures and out the front door into the August air. The night was warm and cricket-loud and smelled of cut grass and petrol and the faint ionized edge of destabilizing wardwork. Luke felt the blood anchor shudder as Harry crossed the threshold, the rerouted magic registering the departure, running its verification check, finding Luke's substituted condition, continued existence on the planet, still met, technically, within all reasonable parameters, and settling, reluctant but architecturally outmaneuvered. He kept his face neutral and his pace steady. You had a bag pre-packed, he said when they reached the pavement and turned away from the house. I keep one ready every August, Harry said. His voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, the way you stated logistical facts you'd stopped attaching much feeling to. Since 3rd year, in case what? In case it became necessary to leave faster than I could pack. Luke walked 2 steps and thought about that. He thought about the 15-year-old version of himself packing a bag in his cabin at Camp Half-Blood, not for a quest, but for the eventuality of a night when staying would become unbearable. He thought about how you stopped calling it a plan and started calling it a preparation, and how the distinction mattered more than it should. Who taught you the extension charm? Hermione, Harry said. My friend. She taught me in 2nd year for a different reason, but the application was obvious. She know you're doing this, she knows I've been thinking about it. He paused. She'd have argued with the timeline. But not with the destination. Harry glanced at him sideways. I didn't know the destination until 40 minutes ago. Fair, Luke said. The ward fluctuation hit the ambient layer somewhere behind them. Luke felt it in the back of his skull, the pressure release of a rerouted system finding its new equilibrium, and a light came on in a bedroom 2 houses down, someone pressing their fingers to their temples at the edge of sleep. Luke increased his pace slightly. Harry matched it without comment. The portkey was a drachma, ancient Greek, worn smooth at the faces from years of handling. Luke had carried it since a contact in Athens had pressed it into his palm 18 months ago with the specific instruction that it would be needed, which was the kind of statement his father's network specialized in delivering without context, useful information stripped of its most useful component. He'd spent 18 months not knowing what it was needed for. He dug it out of his jacket pocket. When we go sideways, not like apparition, it won't be a straight transit. Try not to. I've traveled by portkey before, Harry said, including one that went to a graveyard in an active resurrection ceremony. A beat. This is probably not that, definitely not that, Luke said. Then I'll manage. Luke held out the coin. Trunk handle and coin at the same time, and the owl's cage needs to be in your grip somewhere or Hedwig ends up in the transit layer, which is a problem for both of you. Harry shifted the cage to his left forearm, curling his fingers through the wire and around the trunk handle in a single adjustment that redistributed the weight without compromising the grip. He took the drachma with his right hand. Luke covered Harry's hand with his own, fingers over the coin, and activated the portkey. The world went thin. This was the thing about Olympian portkeys that no manual explained. They didn't move you through space. They moved you through the myth, which sounded abstract until you were inside it, at which point it was extremely specific and completely impossible to describe afterward to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The world became a smear of story rather than geography. You existed here, then you existed in the place where the gods had decided to be, and the journey between those 2 points was less a transit than a narrative agreement the universe entered into temporarily. The sensation was not nausea. It was the cognitive equivalent of reading the last line of a chapter and having the room you're sitting in briefly disagree with the room in the book. It lasted 4 seconds and tasted like the moment before lightning. They landed on a sidewalk on West 34th Street at 2:47 in the morning. New York in August, the heat coming up from the asphalt, the city's own metabolic warmth, the specific smell of a place that generated its own weather. A cab moved down the cross street. A food cart was already open, its operator impervious to the hour. Hedwig, released into transit, had arrived perched on top of her cage rather than inside it, and was rearranging her feathers with pointed dignity. Harry stood very still for exactly 1 second. Then, "We're in Manhattan." "Yes, you portkeyed us from Surrey to Manhattan in 4 seconds, approximately." Harry looked at the city with the alert, cataloging attention of someone who'd never been here before but was actively updating a mental map in real time. Then he looked at the Empire State Building. "That building, 6th floor is the tourist floor," Luke said, picking up the trunk. 600th floor is Mount Olympus." Harry looked at the building, then at Luke. "That's not a real floor, correct?" "It's also where we're going. This building has 102 floors. 102 floors and then divine territory," Luke said. "The gods follow Western civilization. In the 1940s, that meant New York. They've been here since." He started walking toward the entrance. "Don't touch the columns inside. Don't make eye contact with anyone who appears to be radiating light from the inside. And if anything on the elevator panel is written in a script you can't read, don't." "What would happen if I touched the columns?" Harry asked, walking beside him. "Nothing probably, I'd just rather not find out." "And the script I can't read is almost certainly readable to you at a cellular level," Luke said, "and the door it's on belongs to Athena, and she has opinions about curiosity." He pushed through the revolving door. "Don't test it tonight, we have enough going on." The lobby was open and staffed because New York lobbies were always staffed, the city's overnight operations running with the same density as its daytime ones, just with a different cast. The guard at the desk had the settled, 1,000-yard equanimity of a man who'd worked this specific building for enough years that what passed through his lobby no longer surprised him on a physiological level. He looked at Luke with the dim, instinctive recognition of someone processing a face they'd been told to expect. Then he looked at Harry. Something in the guard's expression did a small, involuntary recalibration, the way a person's face moves when they recognize something important and aren't sure of the protocol. He reached under the desk without breaking eye contact with a space slightly above both their heads and produced a visitor badge on a lanyard, white plastic, gold text, Olympian territory, escorted guest. He slid it across the desk toward Harry. "Him," Luke said, nodding at the desk. The guard's eyes did the slightly unfocused thing, not recognition exactly, more like proximity acknowledgement, the way mortals responded to divine business when it came close enough to touch, and he reached under the desk again and pressed a button on a panel that wasn't the building directory. The elevator opened immediately. Harry pinned the badge to his jumper with a single, practiced movement. Credentials matter, wear them correctly, visible compliance as tactical decision, and stepped in. Luke followed. The doors closed. The buttons on the panel went up to 102, and then there was a gap, and then a single unmarked button below the gap that had no floor number and a very slight warmth to its surface, like something behind it was always running. Harry looked at the button. He looked at the illuminated floor indicator. The numbers climbed past 102 and kept going. Harry watched the indicator with the neutral, data-gathering attention of someone choosing to observe rather than react. He didn't say anything. Luke appreciated that more than he'd have said out loud. "The god we're meeting," Harry said, on the 43rd indicated floor above the building's physical maximum. "Your father, Hermes, yes. And he has something that belongs to me. He has something you've never been told exists," Luke said. "Which is technically the same thing depending on your definition of belonging." "What's your definition?" Luke thought about the question more seriously than he'd expected to. "If someone took it from you before you knew you had it," he said, "it belongs to you. The fact that you didn't know you had it is part of what was taken." Harry was quiet for 2 floors of impossible ascent. "How long have you known about it?" he asked. 3 months, Luke said, "and you came yourself." "Not a letter, not an intermediary. Letters get intercepted," Luke said. "You know that better than I do. Your mail monitoring agreement has been in effect since September 1991. He'd said more than he'd intended. Harry clocked the specific detail, mail monitoring agreement, not a vague statement of surveillance but a named document, and filed it in the precise, unhurried way of someone who wasn't going to raise it now because now wasn't the right time, but who would raise it later with precision. "You know a lot," Harry said. "I know what I've been told," Luke said, "which isn't everything." You'll hear the rest upstairs from someone who was present for the parts I wasn't. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. The corridor was white marble that caught the light from inside rather than from above. The illumination sourceless and consistent the way the lighting in a theater is when it's been designed so carefully you stop looking for the instruments. It smelled of ozone, of old stone, of ink and parchment, and the dry archival quality of documentation that had existed long enough to become its own category of artifact. Harry stepped out, the trunk's wheels silent on the marble. Corridor opened 40 feet ahead, onto an antechamber with columns that were doing structural work and also visibly aesthetic work. And in the antechamber, leaning against the rightmost column with the calculated nonchalance of a man who had been waiting for precisely this long and had opinions about it, was a figure wearing winged sandals and a messenger bag with a caduceus clip, and improbably a bodega coffee cup with property of Hermes, do not take written on it in gold marker. He was holding a manila folder so thick it had been rubber banded along 2 axes. He looked up as they came down the corridor. He had the face of someone perpetually in transit, not restless exactly, but constitutively mid-journey, as though stillness was a temporary condition he was willing to occupy for the duration of a conversation and not a moment beyond. His eyes were the specific, calibrated gold of someone who knew everything currently being said about them in rooms they weren't in, and had structured their entire relationship to information around the assumption that this was normal. He looked at Harry the way a man looks at a piece of overdue administrative work he has run out of legitimate reasons to postpone. Harry Potter, Hermes said. His voice was quick, conversational, the cadence of someone who processed at high speed and abbreviated accordingly. Son of James, son of Fleamont, son of Linfred of Stinchcombe, which is a name that has always struck me as unfairly burdensome. Current ward, formerly binding, presently somewhat rerouted, thanks to my son's creative interpretation of magical contract parameters. A glance at Luke that contained a significant quantity of both pride and exasperation, of the Dumbledore Blood Anchor Protective Statute, signed into Olympian record on the 1st of November, 1981. He paused. Which is 1 day after your parents died. I find the pacing on that interesting. I've always found the pacing on that interesting. Harry looked at the folder. What's in there? He said. Hermes pulled the rubber bands off with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd opened this particular folder many times in preparation for this specific conversation and held it out across the distance between them. 19 contracts, he said. All signed by one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, chief warlock of the Wizengamot Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. And as of a timestamp I have personally verified, cross-referenced, and notarized against the Olympian statutory record, legal magical guardian of one Harry James Potter from the morning of November the 2nd, 1981, to the present date. Harry took the folder. He didn't open it. He weighed it in his hands, not dramatic, just accurate, the way you'd assess any significant object before committing to it. Legal magical guardian, he said, not Sirius Black. Sirius Black was in Azkaban, Hermes said. Sirius Black was arrested at 11:47 in the morning on November 2nd, 1981, Harry said. Not on the 1st, not at midnight, at 11:47 a.m. on the 2nd after a confrontation in a Muggle street in Godric's Hollow. I read that in a decommissioned Ministry incident report in 4th year. He was not in Azkaban on the morning of November 2nd. He was in a Muggle street. He looked at Hermes, which means there was a window. The particular quality of Hermes' attention shifted. Not surprise, he'd clearly anticipated most of what Harry might say, but the specific sharpening that happened when someone arrived at the correct sequence faster than the expected timeline. There was a window, Hermes confirmed, which is, in point of fact, exactly what makes the 3rd contract interesting. He nodded down the corridor. There's a room, I have chairs. I've been standing here for 43 minutes because my son has a complicated relationship with punctuality, which is... I was in Surrey cracking your ward architecture, Luke said. My ward architecture, Hermes said with a distinct lack of ownership, not mine. I was a statutory witness. There is a legal distinction. There are a lot of legal distinctions in this conversation, Harry said. There are going to be significantly more. Hermes was already walking. Follow me, don't breathe on the door with the incomprehensible script. Luke mentioned that, Harry said. Luke mentioned it. Good. A pause. Did he tell you why the script is incomprehensible? Filter mechanism, Harry said, for the curious. Hermes glanced back at him. The glance contained several things, most of them moving too fast to isolate. You're going to be either very useful or very expensive, he said. I haven't decided. I'm going to be neither, Harry said, in a voice that was entirely without hostility and entirely without give. I'm going to be informed. Hermes led them down the corridor without responding to that which Luke thought was the closest thing to concession he'd seen the god make in 3 years. The room was modest by Olympian standards, which meant it was the generous side of a Manhattan studio, and it had a table of dark wood and 3 chairs and oil lamps burning gold rather than yellow, and a window that looked out not on New York but on an ancient sea deep in gray-green, changing its quality of light every few minutes the way a place does when it exists outside of linear time and doesn't bother to pretend otherwise. 3 chairs. Hermes had counted ahead. Luke clocked that and didn't remark on it. Harry sat. He set the folder on the table, rubber bands already removed, and looked at it for a moment with the same forward, assessing stillness he'd used at the door in Privet Drive. Then he opened it. The first document was on parchment heavy enough to classify as card. Its sealed, dark wax, intricate, multi-layered, was warm to the touch when Harry's finger passed over it, radiating magic the way a transformer radiated electricity, constant, enormous, almost incidental to itself. Read the header, then read it again. Temporary magical guardianship assumption agreement, Harry said, his voice even, reading aloud the way he read a legal document, slowly enough to catch everything, between Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore and the Wisengamot of Great Britain, enacted under Emergency Powers Clause 7 of the Magical Guardian Emergency Act 1943. In the matter of one Harry James Potter, age 14 months, dated 2 November 1981. He looked up from the page. He specified my age twice, Hermes said, header and body. He wanted it on record that he was aware. Aware that I was 14 months old, Harry said. He looked back at the document. And the counterpart signature, the one required from the child's existing legal guardians or their designated successor, is where? Absent, Hermes said. Clause 7 permits a temporary assumption without the counterpart signature in emergency circumstances. The word temporary is defined within the Act as a period not exceeding 12 months, after which a full guardianship hearing must be convened and recorded in the Wisengamot minutes. The hearing was scheduled when, March 1982, and the record of its proceedings does not exist, Hermes said. Harry's right hand set itself flat on the parchment. Not a fist, not a grab, just a placement, palm down, with the specificity of someone anchoring themselves to a physical surface while processing a large structural fact. Because the challenge party was in Azkaban, he said. Sirius Black, named primary guardian in my parents' will, was in Azkaban without trial, and without him, without the designated successor appearing to contest the temporary designation, the hearing had no opposing party, and without an opposing party. The Wisengamot clerk recorded a failure to appear and the temporary designation rolled forward, Hermes said, every year, automatically. Until it became, by administrative precedent, permanent. And the will, Harry said, my parents' will, has never been formally read into the Wisengamot record. The oil lamp burned, the ancient sea outside the window shifted from gray-green to a deeper blue-gray, and then back. Albus Dumbledore, Harry said, with the tone of a person stating a theorem before beginning to prove it, used emergency wartime authority to assume temporary guardianship of a 14-month-old, suppressed the formal hearing that would have transferred that guardianship to the designated party, ensured the designated party was imprisoned without trial before the hearing date, and allowed the temporary designation to compound into permanent authority through administrative inaction. He looked at Hermes. That is what the first contract establishes. That is what the first contract establishes, Hermes said. There are 18 more? There are, Hermes said. Harry turned to the second contract. Luke moved from the table to the wall and put his back to it, arms crossed, and watched Harry Potter work through the documents with the steady, uninterruptible focus of someone who had spent 15 years waiting to understand the shape of his own life and had finally been given the measuring instruments. He didn't offer commentary. There was no commentary to offer that Harry wasn't going to arrive at himself faster and more accurately than Luke could have phrased it. And this was not Luke's story to talk over. He'd cracked the wards. He'd made the portkey work. He'd carried the folder from the elevator to the table. The rest of it belonged to the green-eyed kid at the table, who was reading Contract 2 and who had, Luke noted, already started taking notes on a small pad he'd produced from his jacket pocket, cross-referencing dates, writing questions in abbreviated shorthand, building a map of the architecture one document at a time. Outside the window, the ancient sea kept its own counsel. Luke looked at it and thought, you came here to do something unambiguous and you've done it, and the rest of it starts now. He looked back at Harry. The lamp burned. The parchment rustled. Hermes refilled his coffee from a flask and did not speak because whatever else he was, he understood that the most useful thing he could do in this particular moment was be very quiet and let the documents do the work he'd spent 11 years not being able to make them do. Harry turned to the third contract and read and wrote, and the word temporary sat in the first document's header like a door that had been locked from the outside on the morning of the 2nd of November, 1981, and had been waiting with the specific patience of legal language, for someone with the right set of tools and the right quality of attention to notice it was never supposed to have been locked at all. Chapter 2, 19 signatures. The second contract was about money. Harry had half expected it. There was a certain logic to financial exploitation appearing alongside legal exploitation. One lock usually meant others, and the person who'd built the first one had demonstrated both the patience and the technical vocabulary to build a complete system. But the specific mechanism was sufficiently intricate that he read it twice, set it down, and looked at Hermes. "Explain the blood ward maintenance fee. It's creative," Hermes said with the tone of a craftsman examining a rival's joinery. "The argument runs as follows. Your mother's sacrifice created the blood ward protection. Blood ward protections of that magnitude require active magical maintenance to remain viable, recalibration, periodic renewal, structural reinforcement. That maintenance under this contract is billed to the Potter estate at a rate of," he tapped the relevant clause, 12,000 galleons per annum. Per annum since when? November 1981. Harry did the arithmetic and the time it took to breathe in. "That's over 200,000 galleons. 216,000, Hermes confirmed. "Which accounts for a considerable portion of why, if you walked into Gringotts tomorrow with your vault key, you would find your trust vault substantially lighter than your parents' total estate would suggest it ought to be." "The maintenance fee," Harry said, "is billed to whom, paid to whom?" Hermes took a measured sip of his coffee. "A holding company registered in the wizarding financial territory of Luxembourg. The company's registered director is listed as 1A PWB. Dumbledore, acting in his capacity as Hogwarts school headmaster." Luke pushed off the wall. Not all the way, one shoulder came forward, the rest of him stayed, a partial movement that expressed something he hadn't decided whether to say yet. "He's billing himself," Luke said. "He is billing the Potter estate," Hermes said with precise care, "for a service that he is also, under his guardianship authority, the sole qualified party to confirm is being performed. He certifies the necessity, he certifies the execution, he receives the payment, a beat, for 14 years. Harry set the second contract on top of the first, both palms flat, papers aligned. He reached for the third. "You said the third one was the interesting one," he said. "I said the discrepancy about Sirius Black made it interesting," Hermes corrected. "Which is a narrower statement. The third contract was longer than the first two combined, dense with subclauses that had their own subclauses, attached appendices in a different hand, and a cover sheet written in the formal, unhurried prose of someone who'd learned to make bureaucratic violence indistinguishable from procedural care." Harry read it the way he'd read the others, completely, from the first word, without skipping toward the conclusion he'd already partially reached. The oil lamp threw a shallow circle of gold over the parchment, and not much beyond it. He read for 4 minutes without speaking, then he petitioned for Black's incarceration. The room held its particular quality of silence. He submitted a formal recommendation, Harry continued, not looking up, to the then Minister for Magic that Sirius Black be detained without trial under emergency wartime powers. On the grounds that Black's release would create, he found the clause, a political security risk by enabling the continued existence of an unregulated guardian for the Potter heir, whose security arrangements are fragile and must be centralized for the protection of the broader magical community. He looked up. He wrote centralized. He did, Hermes said, not protected, not managed, centralized. The word choices in legal documents, Hermes said, are rarely unintentional. The recommendation was accepted. The recommendation was accepted, Hermes confirmed. The trial was not scheduled. Harry put contract 3 on top of contracts 1 and 2. The stack was building with the specific gravity of things that had existed for a long time in a form that couldn't be unfound. He looked at the stack for a moment, not hesitating, orienting, the way you orient before a climb to check your footing rather than because you're reconsidering the climb. Then he reached for contract 4. Luke watched him and said nothing because Harry Potter reading a contract was not a process that required or invited commentary. It required the same thing a surgical procedure required, the right instruments, adequate light, and everyone else staying out of the way. Work through contracts 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the next 40 minutes. 4 was an educational trust, the original Potter bequest to Hogwarts, which had specified that Harry be given access to the full range of Hogwarts elective coursework plus, in a clause his grandfather Fleamont had apparently added in 1975, the option to pursue the first 2 years of study at Beauxbatons or Durmstrang as a continental supplement to his British education. The clause had been administratively voided in 1991 by a codicil signed by Harry's legal magical guardian, who was Albus Dumbledore, who was also the headmaster of the institution the clause represented a potential departure from. Harry read the voided clause twice. He wrote something on his pad. 5 was a curriculum oversight contract signed with the Hogwarts Board of Governors, establishing the headmaster's authority to exercise veto power over elective coursework choices for students whose enrollment was classified under a school security designation. The security designation in question was applied to exactly one student. The contract listed the restricted elective categories explicitly. Magical law was the third item. That's why I was never offered magical law, Harry said, and his voice didn't change pitch or texture, but his pen made a short, hard mark on the notepad. 6 was a Board of Governors contract further classifying the headmaster's oversight of Harry's extracurricular activities, Quidditch, inter-house events, unsupervised student movement, as matters of school security rather than educational discretion. The practical effect was that any activity Harry participated in could be cancelled, redirected, or surveilled under security classification, without the oversight review that normally applied to headmaster decisions. The Board of Governors couldn't challenge it. It had been classified beyond their jurisdiction by the headmaster who'd asked them to sign it. 7 was the one that made Luke move fully away from the wall. It was a disqualification notice for one Flemmont Potter, Harry's paternal grandfather, removing him from the Hogwarts Board of Governors on the grounds of a conflict of interest arising from a financial relationship with a Hogwarts supplier. The disqualification was dated 1987. Flemmont Potter had died in 1979. He disqualified a dead man, Luke said. He backdated a disqualification notice for a man who had been dead for 8 years, Harry said, to remove a Potter family presence from the board that oversees Hogwarts governance. He looked at the document's seal. The seal is genuine. Someone in the Ministry's records office filed this. Someone held a quill and wrote a dead man's name and dated it 8 years after his death and filed it in the official record. The Ministry does what Dumbledore asks, Hermes said, not with relish, with the flatness of stating geography. He has been its most credentialed authority for 40 years. He doesn't issue instructions. He frames suggestions in terms of institutional necessity, and institutions recognize institutional necessity the way dogs recognize the smell of food. Harry put contract 7 on the stack. 7 contracts. The parchment sat there in the lamplight with the density of everything that had been decided for him before he was old enough to understand that decisions were being made. He reached for contract 8, Hermes said before Harry could read the header. That one took me longest to agree to include. Harry read the header anyway. Then he put the document flat on the table and left both hands on it and looked at a middle distance slightly above the ancient sea outside the window. The document was a prophecy intelligence sharing agreement between Albus Dumbledore, acting in his capacity as Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, and the ICW War Council. Under the agreement, Dumbledore provided the ICW with the full text of a prophecy naming Harry Potter and the Dark Wizard Voldemort as its principals, along with Dumbledore's strategic analysis of its implications, in exchange for 3 enumerated considerations. Political endorsement of Dumbledore's candidacy for a second term as Supreme Mugwump, a guaranteed seat on the ICW War Council in the event of an active Dark Wizard classification in Britain, and in the third clause, which was the one Harry's hands were resting on, a reasonable allocation of international magical resources to support the long-term management of the British magical conflict, including the cultivation and positioning of the prophecies named principles as required by strategic necessity. Cultivation and positioning, Harry said, reading aloud. His voice was level. It was precisely level, the way a spirit level is level, measuring rather than performing. Yes, Hermes said. He sold access to my prophecy to an international body in exchange for political power and called the management of my life cultivation. He traded strategic intelligence about an active dark wizard threat for coalition resources, Hermes said. That's the charitable reading. Are we reading charitably? I'm reading the document as writs. You read it as you need to. Luke, from the wall, the prophecy named you and Voldemort as its parties. You are the central asset in any strategy built around it. Dumbledore sold access to an asset that wasn't his to sell. Harry looked at him across the table. Then down at his hands on the parchment. Yes, he said, that's the right word. Asset, a pause, keep reading. Contracts 9 through 13 were financial instruments and administrative waivers of increasing technical density, each one requiring Harry to stop and ask Hermes for a specific clarification about wizarding financial law or ICW political protocol. Each answer delivered in Hermes' rapid, stripped-down shorthand that removed every cushioning word and left only the operative fact. Harry wrote everything down. His handwriting was getting smaller and faster, the marks on the page tightening as the scope of what he was reading tightened. Contract 13 was a Hogwarts succession clause. It removed the last remaining Potter family designee from the school's founding family advisory board, a ceremonial position mostly, but one that carried the right to request a full board of governors review of any decision touching a Potter family student, through a technical disqualification citing a conflict of interest that postdated the designee's death by 11 years. A second backdated disqualification, different records office, different clerk's hand. Harry noted it on his pad without speaking, the pen moving in a short, compact line. Contract 14 was the Wizengamot political waiver, and it was the one that, when Luke had seen the summary sheet 3 months ago, had made him stand in Hermes' office for 30 seconds without moving. It was a document in which Albus Dumbledore, acting as Harry's legal magical guardian under the authority established in Contract 1, waived Harry's right as a Potter heir and registered Wizengamot voting member to contest certain categories of ministry decision until Harry reached the age of 25. Restricted categories covered the designation of dark wizard threats, the deployment of aura resources in response to those threats, and in a subclause on page 4 in slightly smaller type, appended to the main text as though it were a minor administrative addendum rather than the contract's most significant provision. The ministry's right to manage the personal activities and movements of individuals designated as central to the resolution of an active dark wizard classification. Harry read the subclause, then turned back to page 1 and read the contract from the beginning, the whole thing without stopping, and then turned to page 4 again. He waived my right, Harry said, to control where I go and what I do, during a war I didn't choose to be in, on my behalf. Using authority he obtained through a fraudulent credential signature, he looked at Hermes. I was a year old when he signed this. You were, Hermes said. This is why Fudge can override Dumbledore's decisions, but not mine, Harry said, and something in his voice shifted, not louder, not harder, but more exact, the way a lens shifts when it finds the correct focal length. If I challenge a ministry decision as a Wizengamot member, I have standing that Fudge cannot dismiss. If I contest the management of my own movements during a conflict classification, I can force a formal review. But this waiver removes that standing until you're 25, Hermes said, or until it's formally challenged and struck from the Wizengamot record. Which requires a party with legal standing to initiate the challenge, Harry said, which requires either Sirius Black, who has not been given a trial and therefore doesn't have cleared legal status, or me, acting as my own legal representative, which requires me to have majority, which I won't have until I'm 17 unless, he stopped. His pen tapped the notepad once, unless there's a provision for emancipated minority status. Hermes didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. There is one, Harry said. It wasn't a question. There is one, Hermes said, but it's not in the wizarding legal framework. It's in the Olympian Wizarding Covenant, the founding document your community's ancestors signed with the Greek divine pantheon in the 15th century, when they were building the first permanent magical infrastructure in Britain and needed protections they couldn't generate internally. He opened his messenger bag and produced a second, narrower folder, cream-colored, which he set on the table but did not yet open. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to it after the remaining contracts, Harry said. Yes, how many remain? 5. Harry picked up contract 15. 15 was the health and medical consent agreement. It authorized Dumbledore as Harry's legal guardian to make medical decisions on Harry's behalf and specified that St. Mungo's hospital was to notify the headmaster's office directly before the patient and before any other party in the event of any presentation by Harry Potter. The stated justification was confidentiality and security during an elevated risk period. The practical effect was that if Harry was injured or ill or brought to St. Mungo's for any reason, Dumbledore received notification first and controlled the information flow about Harry's condition. Harry read it and set it on the stack. His face was doing nothing in particular, which was not blankness but the active, effortful neutrality of someone channeling everything into the reading rather than the reacting. 16 was the Mail Monitoring Agreement. Ministry Department of Magical Communication, operative since September 1991, 3 weeks before Harry's first year. All wizarding correspondence addressed to Harry Potter, copied to the headmaster's office. The agreement specified categories of correspondence to be flagged for direct review: legal documents, financial notifications, communications from incarcerated individuals, and communications from foreign magical institutions. Harry read it and set it on the stack. He made one mark on his notepad. 17 was the defense against the dark arts curriculum contract, not a teaching contract, not an employment agreement. Specific, named educational contract between Albus Dumbledore and the Hogwarts Defense Against the Dark Arts Professorship. Formalized, sealed, binding on each successive holder of the post. Specifying that the Dada curriculum for one Harry James Potter be modified in years 1 through 7 to exclude offensive magic above a designated classification threshold. The threshold was specific. It was also annotated. In the contract's margin, in a different hand than the rest of the document, Hermes had written, "Student assessed at time of contract signing as capable of learning material at the excluded level." Exclusion is not capability-based. The annotation had a date stamp, 1991, autumn term. Harry read the annotation. He read the threshold classification. He turned back to the header. "He restricted my training," Harry said, deliberately. "While knowing I could learn the material." "Yes," Hermes said, "the restricted level includes," Harry turned pages. "Shield variations above Category 4, offensive severing charms, dueling theory above intermediate classification, conjuration under combat conditions." He set the page down. "This is the difference between someone who can survive an encounter and someone who can end one." The silence in the room changed quality. It had weight now, a specific physical weight, the kind that accumulated when you spent enough time in a space where large, ugly truths were being named precisely. "He was keeping you viable," Luke said from the wall. His voice was flat, not strong, viable. "Good enough to function in the encounter the prophecy required, not good enough to make the encounter unnecessary." Harry looked at him, then at the contract. He looked at it for long enough that the ancient sea outside the window completed one full cycle from gray-blue to deep green and back. "No," he said. "That's not quite it." He tapped the restriction clause. "The threshold," he said, "isn't the threshold for surviving an encounter with Voldemort. It's lower than that. This threshold keeps me functional enough to be present for the encounter. What he restricted is the category of magic that would give me options about how the encounter concludes." A pause. "He didn't want me to have options." Luke said nothing. Hermes said nothing. The lamp burned. Harry put contract 17 on the stack and picked up 18. 18 was a political liaison agreement between Dumbledore and the Department of Mysteries. Brief, precise, and cold, 3 pages against the multi-page edifice of the financial and legal contracts. It established a channel of communication between Dumbledore and the Unspeakables in the Department of Mysteries that bypassed standard ministry oversight, specifically regarding the monitoring and analysis of prophecies involving named wizarding individuals. The agreement granted Dumbledore the right to receive unspeakable briefings about any prophecy touching a person in his legal guardianship, outside normal disclosure requirements. He'd known about the full prophecy since it was made. He'd managed access to it, who knew it, how much they knew, how the knowledge was deployed, through official channels he'd built specifically for that purpose. Harry read it, set it down, and reached for contract 19. Luke had seen the header of the last document on the summary sheet 3 months ago, and he decided then that it was the one with the sharpest edge and that Harry needed to reach it in sequence. He watched Harry read the header, watched his eyes track to the date, watched the date register. Harry put his index finger on the date stamp and held it there. Contract 19 was dated July 22, 1995, 14 days ago. It was a preemptive locate and return order, drafted as an agreement between Albus Dumbledore and the Hogwarts Board of Governors, to be automatically activated in the event that Harry Potter departed his designated residence, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey, for a period exceeding 48 consecutive hours during the summer term. Upon activation, the order authorized the Ministry's Auror Office to locate Harry Potter and return him to his designated residence under the authority of the Magical Guardian Emergency Act 1943, with the Headmaster's Office coordinating all communications. 14 days ago. "He wrote this 2 weeks ago," Harry said. "Yes," Hermes said, "before I left, before tonight, yes." "Which means he anticipated the possibility of my leaving." Harry looked at the date stamp. "Which means either he knew someone was coming," a look at Luke, "or he determined that conditions at Privet Drive had deteriorated to the point where I'd reach a threshold and leave on my own, and he prepared for it rather than addressing it." He turned the last page of the contract. "And then he prepared a legal mechanism to return me automatically, rather than contacting me, rather than adjusting the conditions, rather than," he stopped. He turned back to the beginning of the stack, all 19 contracts sitting there in their accumulated order. He looked at the full height of the pile. "It's not malice," Harry said. He said it the way you say something you've worked out through the reasoning rather than felt, and you say it out loud to check whether it holds. "It's not that he hates me or wants me to suffer. He doesn't. He probably genuinely believes each individual decision was correct. He does, Hermes said. I've spoken with him. He does. That's what the structure tells you, Harry continued. If this were malice, the contracts would be simpler. Malice is efficient. This is administration. Every contract is internally justifiable. The blood ward maintenance fee could be defended as a real expense managed imperfectly. The guardianship assumption could be argued as an emergency measure that got procedurally lost. The prophecy sharing agreement could be framed as building the alliance necessary to defeat Voldemort. He looked at the stack. Each individual contract has a story Dumbledore could tell about it that would sound reasonable. It's only when you read all 19 that the story changes. What's the story? Luke said, because Harry had been building to it and it needed to be said out loud. Story, Harry said, is that Albus Dumbledore has spent 15 years building an architecture of control around one child, using that child's legal vulnerability, his financial assets, his educational access, his movement, his medical information, and his correspondence, to ensure that the child arrives at the conclusion Dumbledore requires in the condition Dumbledore has calibrated. With none of the resources or legal standing or training that might allow the child to arrive at a different conclusion instead, he paused. And the story he tells himself is that he's protecting the wizarding world from Voldemort, and he's right that someone has to. And he's decided with genuine conviction and impeccable logic that this is the only method available, and that the cost is acceptable because the alternative is worse. The room was very quiet. He's not wrong about the stakes, Harry said. He's not wrong that Voldemort is the threat. He might not even be wrong that sacrifices are required. The pause this time was longer. He's wrong about whose choice that is to make. Luke looked at the floor, then at the wall. Then at the sea. He'd had this conversation with himself at 15 in a different register with different vocabulary in the context of a different divine authority who'd made different calculations about acceptable costs. He'd come to a different conclusion then. He was still living with that conclusion, would be living with it for a long time yet. And he was not going to say any of that right now because it wasn't useful and this was not about him, but he noted the convergence with the specific recognition of someone who has heard a piece of music before in a different key. The cream folder, Harry said, turning to Hermes. Hermes opened it. The document on Olympian vellum was 3 pages and written in a language that was formally Greek but carried at its edges the particular resonance of something much older than Greek, something that predated the language it had been translated into. Hermes walked Harry through its content in the same rapid, stripped-down shorthand he'd used for the wizarding contracts, without softening or editorializing. Luke listened from the wall and tracked the parts he hadn't been told in full. The Provisional Legal Autonomy Declaration. An instrument of the Olympian Wizarding Covenant, the founding agreement between the Greek divine pantheon and the original British wizarding community, signed in 1432. Under the covenant, a minor who is the sole surviving legal member of a registered wizarding family, and who could demonstrate that their designated guardian had acted in material breach of their guardianship obligations, could petition the Olympian court for a PLAD, a declaration granting them sufficient legal standing to initiate a formal Wisengamot challenge as if they had already reached majority. It did not grant full adult majority, it was specifically and narrowly scoped, but it was enough to put Harry in a room with the Wisengamot under his own authority rather than Dumbledore's. The petition required 2 signatures, the petitioner and an Olympian statutory witness capable of attesting to the breach. You're the statutory witness, Harry said. I witnessed 3 of the 19 contracts, Hermes said, the guardianship assumption, the blood ward maintenance agreement, and the prophecy licensing agreement. I signed as Olympian statutory witness, which is a role established under the covenant for contracts of sufficient scope and permanence. I signed in 1981. He folded his hands on the table in a gesture that was not natural to him, which made it conspicuous. I signed because Albus Dumbledore presented me with a credential verification document confirming that Sirius Black, as the Potter family's designated representative, had reviewed and consented to the contracts. Harry watched him. The verification document was dated 9:00 a.m., Hermes said, the morning of November 2nd, 1981. His voice stayed level with the particular effort of someone who had rehearsed this sentence many times in the privacy of their own accounting. Sirius Black was arrested at 11:47 a.m. on the same date. The 3rd contract, the one containing the petition to detain Black without trial, was signed at 2:15 p.m. Harry let the sequence sit for a moment. The consent verification was created before the arrest, Harry said. Dumbledore presented you with a credentialed document showing Black's consent at a time when Black was still free. Then he arrested Black or arranged his arrest and signed the third contract at 2:15. By then, the consent document was already in your possession, already dated, already creating the appearance of a legitimate process. Yes, Hermes said. You didn't know the arrest had happened. I knew by 1992, Hermes said. I confirmed the date discrepancy in 1992, 11 years later, yes. And Dumbledore knew you'd confirmed it. The silence this time had a different texture, thicker, more expensive. He did, Hermes said. We had a conversation. His voice went momentarily flat in a different way, not the neutral flatness of reportage, but the flatness of someone tamping down something they're not going to perform in front of witnesses. He explained that the stability of the British wizarding world during the anticipated second rise of Voldemort required these arrangements to remain undisturbed. He suggested that a unilateral Olympian move to expose wizarding legal practices through covenant channels would be an unfortunate precedent. Hermes paused. He was not threatening. He doesn't threaten. He identifies consequences and presents them as shared concerns. Institutional trust, Harry said. He framed the exposure as a risk to the Olympian wizarding relationship. He is very good at what he does, Hermes said for the second time, and for the second time it sounded like genuine, reluctant, complicated professional acknowledgement. Why now, Harry said. Why are you doing this now? Hermes looked at the cream folder. Because contract 19 is dated 2 weeks ago, he said. Because in 1992, when I confirmed the discrepancy, Voldemort was not yet re-embodied and the probability distribution of outcomes still had reasonable width. Because tonight, with a re-embodied Voldemort and a boy who has already survived one graveyard and a locate and return order filed in anticipation, he stopped. Because the model changed, and because I have been a statutory witness for a very long time, and I know what it looks like when an architecture of management stops being a precaution and starts being a conclusion. Harry held his gaze for 3 full seconds. You also need the PLAD petition on record, Harry said, because it creates the legal documentation that you were deceived in 1981. It exonerates your witnessing retroactively. You need this, Hermes said without any of the deflection of a man who'd been hoping the point wouldn't land. Yes. Thank you, Harry said, for saying so. He picked up the quill. It was already there, Olympian quill, already inked, gold, placed on the table at some point in the last 2 hours by Hermes with the quiet forward planning of a god of messengers who had been composing this particular dispatch for 11 years. Harry looked at the signature line. He looked at the language of the petition for exactly as long as it took to confirm it said what Hermes had told him it said. He signed his name. Hermes left them at 5:30 with the signed petition and the quiet efficiency of a man who had a great deal of filing to do before morning opened the Olympian legal archive. He said 3 things on his way out: that the PLAD petition would be processed same day under the Covenant's emergency protocols, that the Wisengamot would receive formal notification by evening, and that there was a safe house on West 23rd Street, 3rd floor, stocked, clean, 3 exits. He said all 3 things at the door in order, and then he was gone with the specific vanishing quality of a god of travelers, not dramatic, just suddenly no longer present, the way a message disappears once it's been delivered. Luke and Harry took the elevator down through the impossible floors without speaking. The lobby guard was still at his desk, different coffee, same equanimity. The city outside had moved from 3 a.m. into 5 a.m., which in New York meant a density shift rather than a quieting. The overnight staff and the earliest risers occupying the same streets with their separate purposes, the garbage trucks running, the first delivery vans, the sky over the East River going through its pre-dawn negotiations with the light. They walked west on 34th Street with the trunk rolling between them. Harry carried the manila folder under his left arm. Luke carried nothing, which was the default state of a person who'd been living exiled and mobile for 3 years and had streamlined possession to what fit in a jacket. 23rd Street is 15 blocks south, Luke said. I know where it is, Harry said, then a beat later, sorry. That wasn't, I just know the city grid, maps. You've been to New York, never. I read about it, a pause. I read about a lot of places I've never been. Luke absorbed that. They walked. The safe house was exactly what Hermes had described. A 3rd floor walk-up with clean lines and functional furniture and the absence of any distinguishing feature that would make it memorable from the outside. 3 exits, front door, fire escape off the back window, and a roof access hatch that Luke had used twice before. The wards were subtle and secular and had nothing of Hermes' divine signature on them, which was deliberate and correct. The refrigerator had been stocked recently. The kitchen table was large enough. Harry turned off the overhead lights when they came in and left the lamp on the kitchen counter. Luke didn't ask about it. People who'd grown up in spaces where light meant visibility and visibility meant exposure developed particular habits about lighting, and commenting on those habits was the kind of thing that made people feel surveilled. He made coffee. Harry was already at the table with the folder open and contract 14 on top. Not the last one, not the most recent, but the Wisengamot waiver, the one with the subclause about movements and personal activities. His notebook was open beside it and he was cross-referencing, writing annotations in the margins of the notepad in handwriting that had gotten even smaller since Olympus. Luke set a mug by Harry's elbow and sat down across from him with the other. "The locate and return order," Harry said without looking up. "It activates automatically at the 48-hour mark from my departure." "What time did we leave Privet Drive?" 2:31, Luke said. "I have the portkey activation log." "Which puts activation at—" Harry looked at the kitchen clock. 6:14 a.m., approximately 2:31 tomorrow morning. "The PLAD petition processes same-day Wisengamot notification by evening. The question is whether the notification is formally received and logged before the order activates. Same-day Olympian processing could mean anywhere from mid-morning to late afternoon," Luke said, "and formal Wisengamot receipt could add another 2-3 hours. So it might be simultaneous, or the order activates first." Harry turned to contract 19. "The order authorizes order deployment. Does Dumbledore have to actively trigger it, or does it go automatically to the order office?" "It says the headmaster's office coordinates all communications," Luke said, which suggests he has to make a communication. But coordinating communications isn't the same as initiating the deployment. The deployment is authorized on the 48-hour trigger. He might not be able to stop it even if he wanted to. Harry looked at the clause. "He won't want to stop it," he said. "Stopping it would require explaining why. He'll let it run and then manage the aftermath." "Which means we need to not be findable when it runs," Luke said. "I signed the PLAD petition," Harry said. "The moment that's on the Olympian record, I'm a petitioner in an active covenant process. There's a procedure for that. It's in the 4th appendix of the vellum document. I read it while Hermes was explaining the main clauses. A petitioner in an active covenant process has provisional protected status under Olympian wizarding covenant law. The order office can't execute the locate and return against a protected petitioner without triggering an international magical incident." Luke looked at him. "You read the appendix." While Hermes was talking, he talks fast, there was time. He was explaining a fairly dense legal instrument. "I read quickly." Luke took a drink of coffee. Thought about asking when Harry had developed the habit of reading legal appendices, while someone explained the main document to him, and then did not ask, because the answer was self-evident and stating it out loud would serve no purpose except to be the kind of observation that people made when they were trying to process something that made them angry on someone else's behalf, and didn't have anywhere useful to put the anger. "The provisional protection needs to be formally communicated to the Ministry," Harry continued. "The Olympian Legal Archive notifies the Wisengamot when it processes the petition, but the Ministry's order office won't receive the protection status automatically. It has to go through a separate Ministry Olympian liaison channel." He looked up. "Does Hermes have a contact in that channel?" "He has contacts in every channel," Luke said. "Then he needs to ensure the protection status reaches the order office before or simultaneously with the order's activation." Harry wrote something on the notepad and then looked at Luke directly. "Can you reach him?" "Yes, do that then." Luke pulled out his phone. Olympian network adapted, worked across divine and mortal frequencies, the modification done in a basement in Queens by a Hephaestus kid who owed him a favor and had asked no questions. He composed a message to Hermes' contact network, which didn't go to a phone number but to a routing address that resolved to whichever of Hermes' messengers was currently active in the continental US, flagged urgent, and sent it. The response came back in 40 seconds. "Received. Protection status notification queued for simultaneous transmission with PLAD processing. Estimated processing window 11 am to 2 p.m. Luke showed Harry the screen. Harry read it and nodded once, the nod of someone striking a completed item from a running list. He turned back to the contracts. They were on their second coffee when the mirror lit up. It was on the kitchen wall, which Luke had registered when they came in and categorized as a standard wizarding communication reflector. The safe house was used by Hermes' network of wizarding contacts as well as demigods, and the mirror was a practical feature. Standard mirrors ran on passive connection. This one activated on an incoming channel, a deep, slow blue light pulsing from the glass, not the silver white of Ministry standard flu, not the gold of Olympian communication, but a specific rich blue that Luke had never seen before and categorized immediately as bespoke. He was out of his chair with riptide in hand before the light finished forming, the bronze blade catching the lamp's gold and throwing it back at the ceiling in a moving arc. The face in the mirror resolved slowly, unhurried. White beard, blue eyes, gold-rimmed half-moon spectacles catching the light in a way that was almost certainly not accidental. Albus Dumbledore looked at Luke's sword the way he would look at a moderately interesting weather phenomenon, observable, noted, not of primary concern. Then he looked past it. "Harry," he said. His voice was warm. Genuinely warm, not performed, not the simulation of care, but the real thing, real affection produced by a man who had tracked this particular person's existence for 15 years and had, in some functional way, made him the center of his professional life. That was the part that made it hard to categorize simply. The affection was real, the control was real, both were real, and the fact that they were both real was the entire problem. Harry did not move from the table. He looked at the mirror, he looked at Dumbledore. "Professor," he said. "I'm glad to see you're safe," Dumbledore said, and he meant it, which Luke could tell by the specific quality of the breath behind the words. "The circumstances of your departure were concerning. I want you to know, how long have you been my legal magical guardian?" Harry said. The question landed in the room with the clean efficiency of a correctly thrown blade, not loud, precise. A pause, very short, almost undetectable, the recalibration of a man who had anticipated many versions of this conversation, but was now encountering the actual version, which had a different posture than his models. "Since shortly after your parents' death," Dumbledore said, the warmth in his voice unchanged. "The arrangements were made in circumstances that were, since November 2nd, 1981, Harry said. Under the Temporary Magical Guardianship Assumption Agreement, Emergency Powers Clause 7 of the Magical Guardian Emergency Act 1943. The designation was temporary. The guardianship hearing required to make it permanent was scheduled for March 1982. Harry's hands were flat on the table. Contract 1 was in front of him. There's no record of the hearing occurring. Dumbledore looked at him across the distance between a mirror in Manhattan and wherever Dumbledore was at 6 in the morning. There are aspects of the legal situation following your parents' death, he said, with the steady patience of a man who had governed difficult conversations for 60 years, that are more complex than they may appear on paper. Your safety was my primary. The hearing didn't occur because Sirius Black was in Azkaban, Harry said. He was in Azkaban because you submitted a formal recommendation to the then minister that he be detained without trial. I've read the recommendation. You wrote that his release would create an unregulated guardian for the Potter heir whose security arrangements needed to be centralized. Pause. Longer this time. The warmth in Dumbledore's expression did not leave. It had the structural quality of something that didn't leave under pressure, which was either admirable or alarming depending on which side of the desk you were on. The situation with Sirius Black was, you also, Harry said, build the Potter estate 216,000 galleons for Blood Ward maintenance using a holding company you directed, certified by yourself, paid to yourself. He turned to the next contract. You voided the educational clause my grandfather added to the Hogwarts bequest that would have given me access to a continental education. You contracted with the Dada professorship to restrict my curriculum specifically and deliberately below the level where I could make choices about how a confrontation with Voldemort concluded. You waived my Wisengamot rights until I'm 25. He looked up. On my behalf, I was a year old. Dumbledore's expression did something that had no clean word for it. It was not guilt. Guilt was a softer mechanism than what crossed his face for the half-second before it composed. It was the expression of a man whose internal accounting was being read aloud by an outside party and who was experiencing, for the first time in a long time, the sensation of being heard rather than assessed. Harry, he said, and the name had a different quality now, not managing, not strategic, just the name, almost plain. What you found, I won't tell you, it is nothing. It is not nothing, he let that sit for a moment, but the situation is larger than any individual decision. The stakes are mine, Harry said. They've always been mine. You've been managing them on my behalf without my knowledge, using legal authority you obtained fraudulently and calling it protection. He paused. Contract 8, the Prophecy Licensing Agreement. You sold access to my destiny to the ICW in exchange for political leverage and called the management of my movements cultivation. Silence. The blue mirror light pulsed. The choices I made, Dumbledore said, and his voice had found a deeper register, slower, the cadence of a man accessing a level of conviction that lived beneath rhetoric, were made in the service of ensuring that the wizarding world survived Voldemort's return. Every decision in those documents, taken individually, can be defended, Harry said. I know, I already worked that out about an hour ago. He looked at Dumbledore across the mirror. They can all be defended individually, that's the design. Dumbledore said nothing. The PLAD petition is already signed and filed, Harry said. I signed it at Olympus 4 hours ago. Hermes witnessed it. It's in the Olympian legal archive and the Wisengamot will receive formal notification today. A beat. The locate and return order you filed 2 weeks ago won't execute against a protected covenant petitioner. I've confirmed that with the Olympian liaison channel. The warmth in Dumbledore's expression shifted not to its opposite, but to something else, something complicated that wasn't warmth or its absence, but a third thing. The expression of a man encountering a variable he'd assigned low probability and was now revising his model around in real time. You've been thorough, he said, and it sounded with a specificity that made the hair on Luke's arms register the temperature of the room, like something his father would say. I had good source material, Harry said. My mother was studying magical contract law in the summer of 1981. I found her notes in the trunk. She was looking at exactly these clauses, the Emergency Powers Act, the temporary guardianship provisions, the challenge mechanisms. He picked up a small, dense exercise book from beside his notepad. Luke hadn't registered it until now, a green-covered thing with cramped handwriting visible on its open page. She was 21 and she was already asking the right questions. Something in Dumbledore's face moved. It moved in the way of something tectonic rather than expressive, a shift in a deep layer rather than the surface, visible only because Harry was watching precisely the right stratum of his face at precisely the right moment. She died in October, Harry said. You filed the guardianship agreement in November. The blue light pulsed twice, slowly. She was remarkable, Dumbledore said quietly, and that was true. Luke could hear that it was true. It was true, and it sat alongside everything else and made it worse, not better. Because a man who genuinely loved Lily Potter and had spent 15 years treating her son as a managed asset was more frightening than a man who'd done it without any complicating feelings at all. I'm not coming back to Privet Drive, Harry said. Harry, I'm not coming back. The locate and return order won't execute. The PLAD petition grants me provisional standing to initiate a Wisengamot challenge, which I intend to do, through a solicitor who operates outside Ministry or Hogwarts contractual relationships. He looked at Dumbledore with the steady, exact quality of someone making a clear statement rather than a threat. I don't want you to be a villain. I've read the contracts and I understand the logic, and I can see that every decision was made by someone who believed he was doing what was necessary. But what's necessary and what was consented to are different categories, and for 15 years I've been living inside decisions I never agreed to, made by someone who decided my agreement was a variable he could manage rather than a requirement. Dumbledore looked at him. The warmth in his face was still there, immovable, structural, real. You have, he said, your mother's precision. I have her notes, Harry said. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the mirror. The blue light went out. Luke stood with Riptide still in his hand in a room that was very quiet. The lamp burned. Outside, Manhattan was finishing its decision about dawn and going ahead with it, gray and orange over the water. He put the sword away. Harry lowered his hand from the mirror and looked at it for a moment, then picked up the Lily Potter notebook and set it carefully on top of the contract stack. He sat back down. He opened the notebook to the page with the underlining, Emergency Powers Clause 7, double underscored in green ink, a question written in the margin in the cramped handwriting of a 21-year-old who had been asking the right questions in the summer before she died. What if the temporary guardian refuses to return the child? Harry looked at the question. He picked up his pen and wrote in the margin below his mother's handwriting in his own less careful hand. Then the child returns himself. He set the pen down. He looked at Luke across the table, across the lamp's shallow circle and the stacked contracts and the particular quality of an early morning that had decided to begin without consulting either of them. The solicitor, Harry said. Edinburgh, I'll call her at 7, Luke said. She'll be awake. How do you know? She's always awake, Luke said. She's that kind of person. Harry nodded. He turned to Contract 1 and began reading it again from the first line, this time with his mother's notebook open beside it, cross-referencing her annotations against the parchment language in the gold morning light, building the case one clause at a time, the way you built anything that was meant to last, carefully, without haste, with the complete attention of someone who understood that the quality of the foundation determined everything that came after. On the notebook's margin in green ink, 30 years old, Lily Potter's question waited beside her son's answer, and the answer was already in motion.